I know this must be a bit disorientating, sort of me just continuing to add these recordings, and then I sort of get sidetracked by these very sort of impassioned ramblings, trying to elaborate and get to the kind of the finer distinction that just kind of summarizes it all. And as I'm talking about it, I often get the sense that I'm right on the sort of on the edge, and then I don't articulate it quite correctly. But anyway, I think I've synthesized now, I think, a pretty good summary. But essentially, I do always fear that I don't give enough of the positive case, because I keep on focusing on the negative aspect of the criticism effectively, and I don't illustrate how the alternative essentially would just do such a better job and would avoid the kind of and be able to circumvent any kind of opportunity of corruption which is created by the ideological convolution. And hopefully in what I'm about to describe and explain, it will show how the alternative doesn't get into the pernicious way in which the one hand washes the other hand, in terms of allowing for a kind of confusion which is an autocrat's dream, effectively, and what allows for a kind of invisible protectorship, that is enforced by a rhetorical demagoguery and a kind of pollution of public discourse into the most kind of vile sort of camps of narcissistic injury that sort of gets into this kind of reactive, self-fulfilling, self-fueling, kind of collapse into depravity, which is what we currently have at the core of the engine of South Africa's public discourse. So the fundamental issue really is, because this is how the ideology of social justice and identity consciousness sort of gets away with itself, is that it says fundamentally what we're dealing with is inequality. Fundamentally, that is what is happening. And because they just can table thump that as a fact that presents itself, that needs to be answered, and that is the only paradigm available, there's no alternative to that, that is just, it's unquestionable. And so it just becomes a question of fact and of a kind of from the kind of the positivistic set of rules, that then everything triggers from that in a kind of reactionary fashion. There's no normative choice, there's no normative framework. The normative framework is that if you check that box, then you must act according to some kind of machine kind of algorithm or something like that. And then what that divorces itself from is the actual structure of the substantive element in the Constitution, which has in understanding what is written in the Constitution, you understand that you cure a disadvantage. This is the fundamental ulterior perspective which the social justice and identity consciousness movement can't actually grapple with. They virtually grapple with this in their ideological filtered way, in their interpretation of things. So what they can't really grapple with is that you don't cure a generalization of a disadvantage, you cure a disadvantage, a particular specific disadvantage. That is the only, in the lives of particular individuals. You can only cure a disadvantage. You cannot cure generalizations of a disadvantage. That is a fictitious entity. So I'm just trying to read my own handwriting now. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what word I've written here, but a generalization of a disadvantage is fundamentally never real, because that can only be supported by a subjective perspective, by also a racialist perspective, by essential racialism, by racial essentialism, or so it's fundamentally a fictitious paradigm. It's the sociological abstraction of that collective entity is a monolith, is a single living hive organism or some dehumanized thing like that. So, because if a disadvantage is said to be held by a collective entity, which only comes subjectively or after the creation of a stereotype or a generalization, then how can it be said as a fundamental point of a kind of objective instantiation or a kind of abject claim that equality is what inequality is the fundamental issue or the fundamental problem, or inequality is fundamentally what is happening in terms of the evil that needs to be cured, or the focus of the problem, the target that needs to be wiped out. So you've got this translation that is now so far removed from the actual specific disadvantage being experienced by particular individuals, into this fiction that it's collectively held and collectively experienced, which obviously has a lot of pandering and safety built into it, which really, this is why protection and security and safety become such sort of buzzwords in the identity consciousness movement, because it's just the panic, it cures all, it's the one size fits all solution. And that is the corrupting sort of influence in how the one hand washes the other, and you get the kind of concentration and autocracy and the tendency towards ad hoc administration, and filtering everything. Anyway, but let me not go onto too many tangents. So essentially, then in order to sustain that equivalency between inequality and disadvantage, it can only therefore be sustained by these yet further subjective projections, which are imposed as a kind of subtext on a systemic level of interpretation. So you have you have these collective entities in which we're all part of society, and then it's very, very arbitrary. So we're all members of the same society, and then we're all also just members of one other subgroup, and that is the only thing that we're sort of allowed to be. There's always this kind of this stark, and whoever sets up those categories, they're unquestionable, but somehow we all have to subscribe to the same kind of matrix, the same kind of identity divisions. Somehow we all have to be plugged into that they're those are the labels that matter, other labels don't matter. Normative labels, normative distinctions, normative differences out the window, effectively. It's very strange. I mean, that whole thing is completely fudged and convoluted. That whole sort of, somehow we all have to be plugged into the same matrix, but also it's all based on subjective relativism, and fundamentally it's even regarded somewhat is that it should be arbitrary, but it isn't arbitrary. So the point to which it's imposed against us means that it all has to be hinged on a scapegoat, that if we just extract our justice from, it's a very kind of it always reduces down to a kind of vampirism in which you need to use boundaries, and the boundaries, you can never have chosen them, so you have to find someone to blame on imposing them on you so that you can enjoy them to use as the vehicle for securing your liberty and protecting yourself and making progress along the identitarian liberation route. It's this weird kind of you know, I mean, it's the very sort of definition of reactionary, and that it doesn't even take responsibility for its own normative constitution. You know, it's this kind of abject normative reaction, um, and essentially this is why the Führer principle comes out, which becomes like a kind of pseudo messianic cult, is that, well, the system has to be saved by some kind of strong imposition that brings justice and sort of addresses the subtext, which, you know, how can you even distill that? How can you even sort of concretize that? It has to kind of, you know, you have to eventually say everyone has to just bow to the historical interpretation that has to become an orthodoxy. So you have to kind of, where is the source of this orthodoxy? And it just kind of gets pieced together by this weird kind of consensus and this kind of um, this weird kind of collective intelligence, or which is vicarious intelligence, which is an external understanding which you have to therefore be imprinted by, and that, you know, it's the good conditioning, you know, which is the spirit of answering the problem in these terms, which are always kind of vague, and you know, you can only generate self-esteem from sort of collecting a narcissistic injury, from collecting some kind of hurt and damage. That's your permission, that's your ambit to go forward and give yourself some imaginary license. And so, you know, you can only be creative in as much as you've been suppressed by the evil, confining, systemic racism. And so it's this weird kind of love-hate sort of dichotomy. Um, Yeah, so I mean, it's so invested into these dichotomies, and it's so enslaved by the narrative. Um, you know, okay, so I mean, sadly you have to go into these vague and nebulous sort of things, because otherwise they'll say you don't really understand what their you know, how, the depth of their fascist poetry. You know, so I mean, yeah, the problem is that it does kind of always have these internal sort of gates that you have to sort of you know, and this is what makes it so fragile, is that, you know, this is why their political figures have to say, you know, have to essentially deliver and hit all these targets, and this is why, you know, they're so incoherent and they come out like fools, because they have to contradict themselves on a rational sense, because they're hitting all these kind of these emotional, psychological things which don't fit together whatsoever. But what's worse is that is the effects of this on the ground. But okay, okay, I said I wasn't going to go into tangents, but anyway, so the real problem is that all of these tensions, all of these confusions, okay, I kind of stated them in the depth of their internal kind of disarray, but these can all just then be projected onto the depravity of the systemic problem, you know. And so a way of sustaining that inequality is the thing that needs to be tackled instead of disadvantage, and that inequality is the problem of a generalized disadvantage. The only way to kind of keep that as a rigid, dependable kind of because that is the main axle of the entire ideological critique and analysis, is that those things have to be working in a perfect and direct correlation to one another, that a generalized disadvantage is real, and so inequality is what needs to be tackled, because generalized disadvantages are tangible entities, or, you know, and so those, and so if you're tackling a generalized disadvantage, which is inequality, you're doing the you know, some you can't be more in league with social justice than that. You can't be more progressive than that. So as soon, if that is the core of your thing, essentially what that means in terms of your relationship to the world, in relationship to what's happening, what that translates to is either everything that does not aid progress, it's because their intention effectively is nefarious, that they're being perpetrators of inequality, which is evil. They are in league with evil because they are not diminishing, they're enhancing inequality. So you get into this whole thing where inequality is a, you know, according to the foundational ideological mechanics is that they don't really actually have a good definition of what good is. Good is tackling inequality. So actually their definition of good actually comes from their definition of evil. So they actually only have a definition of evil. They don't have an independent sense of good. Good is reducing the amount of evil in the world. That's fundamentally what it is. So if you're not attacking and dismantling inequality, you know, that is the only source of good, basically, is tearing down inequality. And which essentially, because they actually think that generalized disadvantage is a tangible thing, is solid, or yeah, even though it's based on a subjective fictitious paradigm, and that, you know, my technical argument is that inequality fundamentally is not what evil is not what wrong is. Those things can overlap, but they're not equivalent. Things that are inequalities can also be evil, but they are evil for independent explanations, independent accounts that are given, normative accounts that are given. And there often is an overlap, but those things are not equivalent. Those things do not translate directly into one another. There's no correlation between them. Okay, so yeah, so the way that equivalency is sustained, in terms of inequality being evil, because generalized disadvantages are what need to be primarily the core of any kind of, are actually the source of moral consideration in the social justice, identity consciousness proponents' mentality. That is the core concern, and that is the primary thing that needs to be faced. Everything else is a secondary sort of sub-concern to that great general equilibrium, which is their sensibility of what justice is fundamentally, which is very delusional, and leads to many kind of ideation over the appearances of things. Finding things that look like other scenarios, that look like other scenarios, that look like other scenarios, that look like this prime thing that I've already stated as the principle, that it's a generalized disadvantage. So much so that they overlook specific disadvantage and specific dysfunction that causes disadvantage. It's completely overlooked because it's not primarily concerned with a generalized disadvantage. That generalized disadvantage is the prime evil, and that obsession is really, it's completely pathological. I mean, you if that is your focus, you are going to hell in a handbasket very, very quickly. And South Africa is a testament to this. Historians that track these philosophical themes and things like that, and these political themes, they will see a complete direct correlation between this ideology and this kind of morality and the state corruption. And how these principles, these poisonous principles that were promulgated through the secondary legislation, the Promotion of Equality Act, how it aided state corruption. Anyway, okay, so let me just finally finish this point. So when the focus is on the generalized disadvantage, that becomes that directly needs to be sustained in the mind of the proponent of identity consciousness, and that will become a projection onto other people that they are motivated by inequality, and it becomes the motivation of inequality is the bad intention, is the evildoer's state of mind. So it becomes a thought filtration system, so basically this is the ideological police, this is the wrong think, that it's this kind of thinking that perpetuates the injustice. That's where they get all that ranting from, which is completely, it's neither here nor there, and in fact it's a problem that is completely synthetic, and it's generated directly from the ideology, and in fact it's directly exacerbated by the ideology. It creates this problem, creates this pitfall, which didn't even have to exist, and it's a complete fucking diversion. It's completely distinct, and it didn't even have to exist to begin with, and it has nothing to do with anything in terms of actually curing specific particular disadvantages. It gets you so far down the rabbit hole that you're not even dealing with pragmatic reality. You're not even addressing any kind of real issue. You're just addressing this strange ideological subsequent issue, which is that it's your way of thinking that is not in league with combating social justice. Therefore you are not combating inequality, which is the fake problem to begin with, or the subjective problem to begin with, and the idea that you're going to sort of promote the perspective of this fictitious entity of a that you're going to cure a generalized, the idea that as you in a generalized way you cure the generalized disadvantage, that you will at the same time cure particular disadvantages. Now, that is an argument that can be made. It actually can be made. The problem is that it's not direct. So yes, you can make that argument, but if it fails, and then you're just going to double down and you're just going to ramp up the radicalness, and you fail because you say, oh no, but it can be just done a different way. It can just be fine-tuned. It can just, it can be mended. It can be improved. We can find new ways of filtering the system, and new kinds of controls and new directives. But the problem is that accountability never rests on political shoulders at that point. You've got a loophole in which accountability just falls through the floor. And so you can't judge your political class on delivering anything, because it's never their fault. Because it's the idea, it's the fault of the system not adopting the ideology in a faithful enough way. And there is no way that you can actually bring any kind of political accountability into not delivering, because it's systemically adopted and inherited, and then apportioned specifically according to the identity consciousness people. It's scapegoated. Okay, so I think that all of these are actually quite important elaborations, so I'm actually glad that I'm going into it, because I think I have found this is the fundamental bottom line, all this stuff that I'm talking about. But okay, so yeah, so there are basically two things. So it's projected onto an intentional landscape, a motivational landscape of why the system is the way it is, in this weird kind of generalized reduction, as if society is a single mind that just needs to adopt an orthodox morality, in which you can just kind of, you don't have to think about the practices and the practical, pragmatic things that are happening on the ground in terms of particular disadvantages. It can all be cured through the vehicle of tackling a generalized disadvantage by just sort of coloring and skewing everyone's morality to kind of be in step with treating the generalized disadvantage, which is another way of essentially believing that the collective entity of certain categories has a distinct moral consideration, is the source of should be the recipient of a kind of racialist pride, as an example, or a kind of or a specific categorization of pride, gay pride, for instance. I do think that this is this is specifically how it entered. This was the vehicle that it specifically became more concrete in people's minds, which is why I say that historically, at least, identity politics really started to define itself after that moment, after sort of the vehicle of gay pride was on the scene. That it was instantly it already existed in spirit in the feminist camp, but after somebody else did it, then they could just kind of do the same thing behind them and do it in the way that they really wanted to, So I mean, it's been pushed by the feminists, but it was really introduced as a historical case through the enjoyment of the specific kind of activism and the rhetoric which entered our culture through gay pride. Okay, that's a bit of a tangent that might distract people. I'm not against gay people. I'm just making a case as to the perniciousness of ideology. It has this weird. It does fall into the same category of problem, because you cannot argue that you should have pride in something that is that you want to claim is just as normal as any other way of being. Something cannot be special and normal. It cannot be it cannot be both of those things simultaneously. So it's this weird kind of subtext. You cannot have pride in something that was, an accident of birth, or that you were just born into something. So either you were just born into it, or it's something special. But and I guess more specifically, the real proximate, sort of problem is that what do gay rights have anything to do with gay pride? How does injustice and pride, how are those things connected? That is the kind of, the fundamental historical thing that I'm saying in terms of the history of identity politics. That is strange. So again, the whole thing about inequality is the problem, and that becomes either a mental landscape, that the system is said to have a mind that has the wrong moral programming, and that should have a pervasive orthodox moral programming that will be the program of the solution, that will kind of filter down and fix everything automatically by its just kind of moral buy-in, which is essentially, groupthink fundamentally, which is also ran on a kind of racism, effectively. So essentially, for that to even work, you have to believe that people are members of their hive collective, that they are dehumanized, homogenous parts of these distinct entities, that they are not individuals, they are representatives of the identity. And that is where they get their kind of their source of moral consideration and, in inverted commas, pride. And this is what the mind of a bigot operates like. That's where it's that's the computer, that a generalized disadvantage or a generalized advantage, a generalized pride, like all these things, they're all generalizations. They're all, essentially, you say that the adjective of the description of reality belongs to these identities. As soon as you have that computation in your mind, your ability to actually have any kind of normative moral system, it's, you have the same value structure as the people who designed apartheid. You have the same way of thinking as the Nazis. This is the fundamental categorization and thought of how society is considered. Generally, if you just want to look at concepts like privilege, societal privilege, structural privilege, these factors have been believed by all racists as the justification for racism. It is a kind of political balkanization, effectively. It completely deflates having a liberal democratic state. It completely deflates it introduces an element of balkanization, in which, essentially the only real stable solution is breaking everything up into completely separate domains, so that you can't complain that people are underrepresented. It is that people, if to avoid the complaint of problematic representation, you essentially, the only stable solution is to have a separate but equal development, to have separate ethno-states, so that the question never arises, because it's unquantifiable, because how much, there are many reasons, there are many factors that go into any kind of outcome, and it's impossible for life to be navigated in any kind of responsible way in which people are actually empowered as individuals, or as, however they want to be themselves, or whatever you might want to say, when they have to contest with these systemic or systematic analyses and interpretations that have to oversee them and overseer, as a representative of their identity faction, that have to sort of go make piecemeal horse trading, they have to have a kind of an arbitration of matters above their head that engage with their personal choices. How do those things intersect? It's not possible. It's an unknown quantity, and in fact the only way to even have that element of politics in operation is to have a very, very poisonous kind of Gestapo-like ad hoc administration. Everything has to be ruled by nomenclatura. That you have these effectively feudal barons, administering, that are plugged into the kind of the Führer principle, or the identity, that are, either way, you get a poisonous political establishment that can't actually deal effectively with anything. And I mean, the problem is that as soon as you have this kind of political stuff in public discourse, everything else becomes a minor factor. Everything else is a secondary concern, to this strange kind of moral blight, which is translated into inequality, which is translated onto projecting onto people's motivation and intentions their unwillingness to get on board with making inequality the only evil that is worth tackling, effectively. And that obsession is blind, is corrupting. It has this group think and blind faith built into it. Okay, I would only just continue to illustrate these points, but I think I have actually covered all the substance, although I guess all the impassioned, kind of complaining doesn't necessarily translate that well into communicating the elements of it simply, but yeah, and the alternative is just so much more clear, in that, it's very clear in terms of what is making progress, and it also gives trust into people to actually being good faith participants as citizens within a republic, and making the best of a situation. And the idea is that essentially what it does kind of cut out is the idea that you're going to hinder people who deserve to be hindered, and that will bring more equality. I mean, that's the most pernicious problem with obsessing over inequality, is that you can cure inequality by not helping anyone. You can make people more equal and thus enhance the problem, in inverted commas, the so-called problem of inequality. You can improve the so-called problem of inequality, and you have made no tangible help available to people who are disadvantaged. That is the biggest problem. And in fact, as long as there is a token recipient, then it makes, and this is why you have such a level of political cadre enrichment and political connections being rewarded, is that the black billionaire is doing it for the collective, is enhancing the pride of the collective, is restoring the pride of the collective. You know, the strong man is sort of, he's doing it for the hive collective. You know, and it's very dehumanizing. And it treats people as token and as instrumental in terms of a kind of in terms of tracking the narrative of this collective entity, and then, you know, like, and then it will always make these impassioned things about how it cares about the little man, or the little people, as you know. I mean, Hitler gave sob speeches all the time about the working class Germans and how they must still be prized because they're Aryan, you know, and they must be treated the same. And there's this, you know, there's this tremendous, you know, rhetorical tradition of offering, you know, these nice things to the smaller members of the collective, of according them dignity and this egalitarianness within their own rank. You know, it's but you know, this is the thing, is that class is never properly addressed. You know, you never actually properly work on making people's lives better, because the whole functioning has been completely distorted into comparing the out-group and the in-group, effectively. And the war between the out-group and the in-group, or the comparative equality or inequality thereof between the out-group and the in-group, becomes the rallying call for the field marshals, for those disgusting, you know, I mean, they will always exist. We have these psychological profiles within the population, and they love to take over. They love to have these underdog ideological, you know, things. They've existed, you know, this is how the mafia works. You know, the problem is that the mafia does not try to take over the presidency. The mafia is just a subculture, and then, yes, they can have their sympathetic sob stories and their narcissistic injuries. Oh, we just wanted to be businessmen. They wouldn't let us be businessmen, so we had to threaten them and sell them protection instead. You know, we had to be ruthless thugs because they wouldn't let us be successful. They held us down, so that we had to sell them protection. You know, like that is the whole, you know, kind of, you know, very strange moral paradox that they run on, is that we were forced into being violent thugs, you know, like, oh, boo-hoo-hoo, you had to be ruthless criminals. You know, it's this weird kind of, you know, they hate the system, but they profit from undermining it subversively, and, you know, they continue complaining about it subversively. I mean, these are the same kinds of personalities. I mean, that's the same basic model as the Ku Klux Klan. It's the same basic model as the identity consciousness movement. As all, I mean, and it has also been a very common model in corrupt African, you know, political, you know, what can only really be called as banana republics, because you have this, you essentially have sometimes even minority governments, in some sense, in which you've got a state in which there are different groups, and it's all just, politics is based on tribal lines, and because you are selling protection from the out group, and so your own political leaders are selling you protection from the other groups of people, and they're also helping you exploit them in some way, that gives your own leadership the kind of the freedom to just exploit everything and to suppress everything, and to suppress, you know, like the clear functioning of things, and you just have very bad institutions degraded by that kind of administrative power that breaks down the rule of law. And this is why there's such a heavy, because the rule of law is, well, I mean, it's in such a weak state in most states almost to begin with, you know, because you don't have it unless it's implemented or been inherited. But as a pre-existing sort of culture that the state is engaged with, but or in the process of promulgating and acting in accordance to, but okay, but that we do have resources in this country that other situations did not have, and that is a constitution which is very clear about these things, and it is the highest law of the land, and it does rule supremely. And so we have no excuse almost for not having our act together. We have people that have betrayed the constitution, and they have not been punished, they have not been brought to book. We do not have a public. We do not have a public protector that is so diverted by all these other things, which should not be going on. That the kind of these thematic source of the real problem, of the fundamental mismatch, and the root of the problem has gone unaddressed. Okay, but still, okay. I think this recording is actually, for all of my impassioned rambling, I think substantively I've now actually fully covered this matter.